Good morning, friends, and welcome once again to It Had to Be Said Theater. Unlike my video on Training Day, I'm not going to assume you've watched this movie, so I'll tell you the basics, but I won't spoil it for you. Proto-Joker Jack Nicholson is committed, sentenced, to a psychiatric hospital because he convinced the people at the normal prison he was mentally unwell. There he meets the chief, a short-haired Doc Brown, Danny DeVito with a thick, lustrous head of hair, and a host of colorful characters. During his stay, Jack, or as he's known in the movie, Mac, reminds the other inmates what it means to be free and thereby human. It's not that the inmates aren't human so much as they've been deprived of some of their most important faculties as humans. Having been classified as mentally ill, they're confined, infantilized, drugged, and stripped of their will to do anything about it. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest might be about the psych ward, but it can also teach us a lot about democracy, the law, the police, and the prison, and how they dehumanize us. The hospital might be symbolic of a prison or more broadly a state, though the sad fact is it's probably a reasonably accurate representation of the prison logic behind what's known as the asylum, or the psych ward, or psychiatric incarceration. There are real places for care, but there are also still places that call themselves hospitals that are little more than prisons. Some people think of the psych ward as a compassionate alternative to incarceration, but like most criminal justice reforms that actually get passed, it's merely renaming the prison. All you need to be stripped of your last freedom is for someone in a position of authority, like a doctor, to sign a form saying you're a danger to yourself or others and it's all for your own good. Only some of the patients are there against their will, but all the patients are treated like prisoners.
Like in a prison, the guards don't need to get rough most of the time. They might even shoot hoops with you.
But if you do anything that goes against the sacred order, they will use violence. Not just to subdue the person who started it, but to punish. One night, the men in the ward, they're all men, have a party. Needless to say, it's against the rules, and they get in trouble. If it sounds like I'm talking about children, that's good, because that's how the inmates are treated. Look how the guards wake them up in the morning after they broke the rules.
Move. Everybody out here. Come on, move it out, move it out. Come on, move it. Martin, get your butt up. Come on. Up. All right, come on. Get that ass up there. What the hell's going on here? Come on, move out.
That wasn't for their health and safety. How was their enjoying themselves a threat to anything other than the authority that says it's not allowed? Authority doesn't exist for the sake of its subjects. It's just propped up by their inaction. If they break the rules, the idea of rules laid down by authority, and therefore the authority itself, are weakened. They need to be punished to intimidate them so they'll never even think of breaking the rules again. It's popular to believe what happens in Cuckoo's Nest is in the past and it couldn't happen again. But it still does, albeit probably a lot less. It shouldn't really be any surprise to people that these prisons have an overrepresentation of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, disregard the rights and safety of TGNC, trans and gender non-conforming folks, use law enforcement, transport response, use solitary confinement and seclusion in cells or rooms, forcibly medicate folks, also known as chemical restraints, use physical restraints, offer extremely limited access to sunlight, fresh air, cell phones, news and media, and the outside world. In addition, sexual violence is routine, there's limited power to appeal legal or medical decisions, and the overwhelming majority of inmates are survivors of previous traumatic experiences. This year, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture presented a report asserting that involuntary psychiatric interventions may well amount to torture. The psych ward is an extension of the prison, and the psychiatrist is the expert recommending people for prison. We live in a world of extremes, with extremes of wealth and poverty, unprecedented state control, and sophisticated propaganda that blames the poor and imprisoned for their problems. Americans have been increasingly socialized to equate inattention, anger, anxiety, and immobilizing despair with a medical condition, and to seek medical treatment rather than political remedies. What better way to maintain the status quo than to view inattention, anger, anxiety, and depression as biochemical problems of those who are mentally ill, rather than normal reactions to an increasingly authoritarian society? People aren't depressed and anxious and suicidal because of some chemical imbalance alone. It's the world around them. And if you think otherwise, maybe you've just never had to deal with the kind of pressures of money and expectations and fear that other people have to deal with every day. We need to question the very basis of psychiatry. Why were doctors given the power to recommend incarceration just because they have degrees? Why are their words on mental illness the final word? Psychiatry has been used to enforce conformity, especially with regard to race, class, gender, or sexuality, with the most marginalized people always taking the brunt. Psychiatry has helped rationalize institutions of power. Here's an example of what I mean. During slavery, psychiatrists invented the term drapetomania as one of several conditions that pathologized wanting to run away and not be a slave anymore. Not wanting to be a slave was a mental disorder. What do you think the cure was? If you said whipping, you were right. Power has long needed experts to legitimize its violence, and psychiatrists have played their part, telling the powerful what they needed to hear with the shine of science and expert testimony.
And if violence is considered legitimate, people might stand by and watch as those around them become its victims.
You would get called crazy and insane for exhibiting any qualities that were considered abnormal, which is why I don't use those words loosely to just mean amazing or shocking. The doctors made up terms to describe any behavior they couldn't explain otherwise, then put them in the DSM and called you crazy just for being yourself.
Said you've been belligerent, talked when unauthorized, been resentful in attitude toward work in general, that you're lazy.
Chewing gum in class?
You seem lazy because you don't want to do hard, thankless, meaningless work for someone else. Or you seem unpatriotic. Don't you believe everything you've been told? You seem to have a problem with authority, so we'll show you how cruel authority can be when you disobey. You might even have oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, because of course there's some jargon to pathologize the natural tendency to resist. And yes, drugs get prescribed to treat it. You might have ODD if you don't simply bow down to all authority and its rules. Autism and ADHD are pathologized as well because we don't want to change society to accommodate people, but just drug up school children so they can conform. Until recently, homosexuality and gender dysphoria could get you labeled insane, and you can be quite sure if the right wing gets its way, that's where we're going back to. One theme of Cuckoo's Nest is democracy. Nurse Ratchet's regime has all the trappings of so-called democratic government. First, Nurse Ratched is in charge of the ward. She makes the decisions and imposes them on those in her care. In a democracy, the people at the top and the people with money make the decisions and impose them on the people they rule. Like in a democracy, the rules are written and implemented for the sake of the decision makers or rulers, not the ruled. The prime goal of such rules is order, as defined by the people in charge. The order imposed by authority is a kind of equilibrium the state always tries to return to. Any disturbance with any power to threaten your authority is immediately dealt with. The state will effect a return to normal as soon as threats are neutralized. We catch a glimpse of this near the end, when something tragic happens, I'm not going to tell you what, and Nurse Ratched says,
"Now calm down. The best thing we can do is go on with our daily routine."
Of course she wants things to go back to normal. Normal is when everyone obeys her without question, where a look in the eye could be a threat, and she could call on the guards on you whenever she wanted. Anything against her order is the dreaded disorder. Her patients wouldn't like it if there was disorder, she says, speaking for them. Occasionally, when Nurse Ratched wants to use democracy against her charges, she takes a vote. If there's a vote, you can blame others for the outcome, not the people who made all the decisions. And never question the system itself. But doesn't democracy mean the people affected by power control power? How could this system be democratic? Let's take a look. First, one person decides which decisions are subject to a vote and which decisions are her exclusive choice. Second, one person decides how to make decisions. She assumes, or wants us to assume, a majority vote or opinion makes the decision legitimate. If you believe that, I beg you to read the short story The Lottery. Third, Nurse Ratched's presence, her piercing gaze, and the threat of violence it implies affect how people vote. Fourth, people who are unaware there is a vote are still counted among the electorate, and fourth and a half, if they abstain, they're considered to have voted against. Fifth, the vote is only legitimate if counted during the meeting, which is set by Ratched.
The chief voted. Now, will you please turn the television set on?
Mr. McMurphy, the meeting was adjourned and the vote was closed.
But the vote was 10-8. The chief, he's got his hand up. Look.
No, Mr. McMurphy. When the meeting was adjourned, the vote was 9-9.
Sixth, Nurse Ratched grants herself the right to speak for people who have not been consulted. Patients in psych wards are often assumed not to be able to speak for themselves. Seventh, she can shut you up by enforcing the rules she set.
You sit down, Mr. Cheswick, and wait your turn.
This is common in a classroom, but you can see it anywhere a person in authority pisses off someone with no political power. Calmness, quietness, civility, and rules are all weaponized to prevent justice and change. It's easy for people in power to be calm when they know they're the ones causing the injustice, and they can refuse to respond to your concerns based purely on your attitude.
I asked you a question.
I heard your question, Mr. Cheswick, and I will answer your question as soon as you've calmed down.
Eighth, if you react with force, you will be subdued, restrained, drugged, electrocuted, and even lobotomized, and the nurse will rat on you to your mom.
You know, Billy, what worries me is how your mother's going to take this.
These are some of the treatments these doctors give you for doing what you want. This is what we call democracy. Authority has control over every door, every procedure, every vote, every decision to punish. It is, of course, all packaged as for your safety and well-being. Every rule has to be followed promptly and to the letter, or will put you in an even smaller cage. The result of following authority all the time is a broken, deferent person who no longer questions the system and its rules. The thing about authority, though, is it's partly just in the mind.
I gotta get out of here. I can't. I just can't. It's easier than you think, Chief.
After all, many of the patients are voluntary. Mac shows everyone how to be free again, to reject the propaganda of authority and rules, and fight for themselves. They're nervous at first, dipping a toe into disobedience to see how cold the water is, and slowly gain confidence. Mac shows them how to kill the asylum in their heads. Rosa Luxemburg once said, "People who don't move don't notice their chains." Mac, the troublemaker, is the one who points out their chains, and the inmates in turn choose to see them, because you have to choose to see something even if it's right in front of your eyes. The second meeting scene has people speaking up.
Mr. Scanlon?
I want to know why the dorm is locked in the daytime and on weekends.
Yeah. I would like to know about our cigarettes. May I have my cigarettes, please, Miss Ratchet?
They've stopped taking everything for granted and started asking for things. Mac has broken the spell. But, of course, authority always has another excuse to maintain the status quo, and we see the true role of the guys in white uniforms, using violence to enforce the rules.
Hey, calm down. Why don't you leave him, Washington? He's gonna be all right.
The patients were stripped of some element of their humanity when they arrived. They found that through demanding justice, breaking rules, and rebelling, they began to get it back. Though I'm not going to explore the theme of colonization this late in the video, it's there. Colonizers make it their mission to save what they see as lost, incomplete people. In the process of civilizing the uncivilized, they have to break them down physically and then over time psychologically. So the colonized or incarcerated have to fight off the ignorance and propaganda that surrounds them. But they regain some of their humanity every day when they challenge authority. They begin to talk back. They question the rules. They engage in civil disobedience.
Gentlemen, stop this. Stop this immediately.
Individual complaints and outbursts can easily be ignored or punished. Collective, direct action is impossible to ignore. The culmination of this unrest or disorder or unauthorized fun is the party scene. The party's not just about having fun. It's the inmates rediscovering who they are when they're free, no longer held back by the terror of the consequences of breaking the rules. The party is them bringing back that element of humanity that had been taken away from them. There are a lot of things we can do to prevent more of this state-sanctioned psychological torture. The details are in links in the description, but to keep it brief, we should focus on community care. That means not expecting others to deal with mental illness, but to intervene as equals to help the mentally ill. We need to understand the social determinants of mental illness, and we do that by listening to the mentally ill themselves. We don't do it by isolating and punishing them. Mentally ill people need freedom, community, and joy, just like everyone. Thank you.